So another mood disorder is bipolar disorder. And over the course of this presentation, we're going to learn a little bit about bipolar disorder and also a little bit about mania. So we're just going to kind of go over some surface stuff of what bipolar disorder looks like. So overall, what happens with bipolar disorder is you have an individual who alternates between two states. And the back and forth between the two states isn't a rapid shift usually. There are certainly some subtypes of bipolar disorder where there's more, quote, like rapid cycling. But I think the first thing we really want to clarify about bipolar disorder is it doesn't just mean someone is, quote, like moody. Sometimes I think we use the term bipolar to talk about someone who goes through like really rapid mood shifts and like, 1 second they're happy and the next they're kind of like sniping at you. That's not really what happens with bipolar disorder. The back and forth is over extended periods of time. And so there are episodes of like hopelessness and lethargy of depression. So you have like extended periods of depression. And then you also have extended periods of an overexcited state, which we call mania. We're going to go through a little bit more what this looks like in a second. Historically, bipolar disorder, sometimes you might have heard referred to as like manic depressive disorder, means the same thing. We just don't tend to use that term anymore. Bipolar as a term is really getting at how mood itself is a spectrum. And with bipolar disorder, you're at like the two poles at either end of the spectrum. And the amount of time you spend in each of them is certainly something that the DSM-5 does talk about a little bit, and there are specific criteria. But what I want to make clear is it doesn't necessarily have to be like a one-for-one back and forth. It doesn't have to be depression cycles into mania, cycles into depression, cycles into mania. There can definitely be some gaps in between of like normalcy. It can be depression, normal, mania. It doesn't have to be like a one-for-one cycle. So, what is this mania state that I've been referencing? Well, mania is by itself a diagnosis in the DSM-5. When it's experienced in conjunction with depression in this specific way, it's part of bipolar disorder. But mania just refers to a hyperactive, wildly optimistic state. And when you hear that description, I'm sure surface level, it kind of sounds great. Like, oh, like why is that a disorder? It sounds like, depression, I understand. Like it's really lethargic, it's really apathetic, it's an inability to feel pleasure. Like, get why depression, it doesn't sound, too fun. But mania, like wild optimism, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem with this quote, like wild optimism and hyperactivity is someone who is in a manic state is optimistic to the point of disregarding reality. It's not just, they're happy and seeing sunshines and rainbows everywhere. Their mind is working so quickly that it's not thinking things through. It's not focusing on consequences. People who are experiencing a manic state sometimes even become delusional. They believe things that aren't true. So when we talk about how bipolar disorder is like this slow motion versus fast forward, both periods of time end up being equally dysfunctional. And it's not that mania is sort of like a nice break and it's fun. It's not fun in the sense that it can really wreak havoc with a person's life. Interesting thing about bipolar disorder, before we get into a little bit more symptomology, is it affects men and women equally, which is a little different from what we saw with depression, because we saw with depression, women were impacted more often. All right, so just a little bit more on what the manic phase can look like, and then I'm going to point you in the direction of an example or two of what bipolar disorder might look like. Mania can be experienced as someone whose speech patterns are really, really quick, who tend to talk more than they would normally, who tend to demonstrate, overexcitement and elation. As I said, a state of mania is characterized by like impulsivity and thinking so fast that you don't think through consequences. So people who are undergoing mania will become oftentimes sexually uninhibited and engage in risky behaviors. They will go on massive spending sprees, max out all their credit cards, because when they're in that state of mania, they're not thinking about the future and they're not thinking that, ooh, maybe I can't spend all this money that I don't have. They will sometimes, like I said, become delusional, believe that they can fly and jump off of buildings. So Mania is really, it is really like a mirror image or a correlate of depression. Just as like as bad as depression seems and as low energy as depression seems and as riskless as depression seems, mania is the opposite. It's very impulsive, it's very energetic, and it's very, very risky. As sort of a last, like fun fact, there is some research which suggests that mania, but bipolar disorder in general, is associated with heightened levels of creativity. It seems that it's probably the manic episodes which are associated with heightened creativity because research demonstrates during a state of mania, you're thinking quickly, and that can lead to all of the like reckless decision making we talked about. But since you're thinking quickly and you're skipping from idea to idea, sometimes you skip to ideas you wouldn't normally. And so there are some examples of some famous people who history now suggests probably had bipolar disorder. Walt Whitman, Virginia Woolf, Samuel Clemens, Ernest Hemingway. But you'll also notice on that list we have some really troubled souls as well. Some people who took their own lives probably as a product of their mental illness. It allowed them maybe to achieve these great heights, but it also brought them down to some really low lows.